This is a presentation about my research at Warwick University Centre for Lifelong Learning. It's under the title Tales of Transition because it's about trying to make a positive difference to the psychological well-being of adults over 65. I chose the topic because I'm 72 years old and I'm a practicing existential therapist, which makes me deeply engaged with aging issues and with trying to develop appropriate counselling services which are also accessible, which is why this is to do with making a positive difference to psychological well-being for people generally from 65 years upwards, who aren't traditionally great users of counselling and talking therapy services. I'm focusing on contributing to a gradual process of also changing negative social constructions of age and aging. Secondly, I'm also challenging currently favoured medicalised attitudes to counselling, which tend to view people as passive patients rather than active agents of change. I'm exploring counselling from the perspectives and wisdom of diverse people aged 65 and over in various stages of later life. I'm defining counselling as a relationship and a learning process which facilitates a sense of personal autonomy and well-being. Narrative inquiry is an approach to the study of human lives conceived as a way of honouring lived experience as a source of important knowledge and understanding. The Centre for Aging Better has been working on issues of aging for several years for a lottery grant, and they came up with the phrase when studying the state of aging in the UK in 2019, aging is inevitable, but how we age is not. Many people in later life do not enjoy those years, even from an earlier age, say, of 50 onwards, on account of the stereotypical attitudes towards old age and aging. In this research, I have my own particular perspective, and because it's research which is reflexive, I think it's important to state quite clearly. I believe that human existence is a lifelong learning opportunity in a socially constructed world. I'm investigating how people learn to find meaning, purpose, and fulfillment in later life, and whether counselling can be a helpful shared learning process in this endeavour. I'm trying to discover how counselling is constructed by older people, and then whether or not it is considered helpful or useful by the people who, in my experience, are generally experiencing later life transitions or changes. The specific research questions are: 1, how are the processes and outcomes of counselling sessions described, constructed, and evaluated from the perspectives of older counselling service users experiencing later life transitions or changes? How will the findings of this narrative inquiry contribute to the very limited evidence for the value of developing social construction of counselling from the service user's perspective? Thirdly, how are experiences of later life transitions and change described by counselling service users in the context of their own life stories? Fourthly, how can issues of ageing, diversity and inequality be addressed in counselling service provision and practice with older people? Fifthly, how can the findings of this research be applied to developing counselling provision and practice, which comprehends and respects the increasingly diverse range of older people in the UK today? Amanda Grenier did research in Canada, which highlighted how talking to people about their day-to-day life experience can contribute to research. She states that older people's accounts draw attention to the importance of process in the experience of transition and later life. Drawing on the insights of older people, she reinterpreted things in terms of turning points and significant experience. She stated that these insights offered a fresh perspective that could bring the suggested models for aging and transition in life closer to the lived experiences and subjective interpretations of older people. She concludes that models that focus on social location, accumulation of experience, and subjective meaning can provide ways of addressing contemporary challenges, such as variations related to disadvantage, diversity, and the intersections between impairment and advanced age. Research by Susan Pickard indicates that we need to reframe aging altogether. I think of aging as a positive and meaningful lifelong process of growth and development. We begin at birth, continue throughout our lifespan until we reach the end of our personal stories. Therefore, aging does not need to be negatively socially imagined as the relentless and distressing experience of decline. The dominant public discourse and the media tend to stereotypically project. The developmental psychologist Erik Erikson argued that one of our key problems at both cultural and personal level revolves around issues of identity. Today, it seems that our defining existential crisis is our fear of aging and old age. A bit of a pun, but fully intentional, because Carl Jung wrote that in his stages of life, he came to the conclusion that adults generally start the second half of their life completely unprepared. The afternoon of life, as he terms it, should also possess its own meaning and purpose. Growing old in a meaningful way was not just looking back at one's life, but also looking ahead to set oneself new goals with the aim of further wisdom. "40 years later, Simone de Beauvoir wrote in The Coming of Age, "In order to prevent that old age becomes a ridiculous travesty of our previous life, there is only one possibility: to pursue a goal that gives meaning to our life, to devote oneself to people, groups of people, an activity, social, political, intellectual, and creative work." Simone de Beauvoir did not want to disappear and to be excluded from the passion of living that she had experienced all her life. She finishes, "It is to be hoped that our personal passions remain sufficiently strong at an older age to prevent that we turn inward. Public discourse about counselling and psychotherapy, and also professional research, has tended recently to focus on the drug metaphor, the treatment for psychologically diagnosable disorders. But it can also be an educational process of relearning, a reforming process, changing our behaviour, and also in those terms, when connected with work on criminal behaviour, it can be a subtle form of social control. But finally, when we look at people like Viktor Frankl writing about the importance of meaning, counselling could be a form of redemption that was connected with spiritual issues. Counselling has existed within the religious framework for many years, and it could be described as a ritual that gives a sense of purpose and justification to those who participate. Orlinsky's work, albeit back in 1989, and studied carefully in terms of understanding what counselling research might be about, was really important in opening up the fact that, as John MacLeod said, counselling is a complex and multifaceted activity. It is not a simple matter to evaluate whether it works. It's important to recognise that the very act of asking whether it works is embedded in a particular way of seeing or perceiving the process. And that is why Orlinsky's research was so important. Right now, we have a very medicalised attitude to counselling, which mainly looks at one of the functions, albeit an important one, in terms of dealing with whether or not it helps us to recover from a diagnosable disorder, such as anxiety or depression. In terms of social construction, as clearly part of my research is very much resting within that field, but stretching a little beyond it. So Mary Gergen, the late Mary Gergen, who worked very much with her husband Ken Gergen, described storytelling as a very important aspect of counselling, albeit storytelling and attentive listening. We tell ourselves stories about our family relations and who we are, sometimes reflecting on our personal world with uncertainty. Sometimes we think perhaps that life could be otherwise. So Mary Gergen says that going to therapy could be seen as a way to create a more satisfying story than the sometimes painful psychological state that one is in. We may never know the truth, but we can build many stories of ourselves that can help us move forward. Well, I'm using qualitative methods in this research, and I think that it's important to understand that people like John MacLeod have stated that the relationship between counselling and society is one in which therapy is continually reconstructed in response to changes in culture and discourse. Anthony Giddens argues that our everyday actions are meaningful to us, but they also reproduce structures which both enable and constrain our actions. Pierre Bourdieu developed a series of tools for researching and thinking about the social world. I believe that this form of bridge building between different methodological foundations of research fuses the twin aims of how, that is our understanding, and why in social research. I think this form of approach, which is very much qualitative, is appropriate to this particular area of study. And it matches up with my own ontological approach to counselling and psychotherapy. As a practitioner researcher, reflexivity is extremely important. I believe that people are constantly engaged in the process of interpretation, and it's this which we should seek to understand. Researchers should concentrate upon how people reproduce social life. Social life can be understood only through an examination of people's selection and interpretation of events and actions. It is not explaining why people behave in certain ways by reference to their subconscious states or environmental conditions, but how people interpret the world and interact with each other. May describes this as intersubjectivity. As a practicing existential therapist, I regularly encounter people over 65, and I'm listening to their stories in a way, it's a gateway into their worlds and their meaning making. I try to gain insight into how people position themselves in relation to others and what is focused on and what may be the message or function of the story they are telling me. I believe that the epistemology of my qualitative approach is suited to research which explores and contextualizes the change and transition experiences of people in later life. I focused on a method devised by Langridge called critical narrative analysis. This applies interpretive lenses to the transcript of my interviews with participants in the research. Narrative analysis is an umbrella term for methods of analysing story from text. I'm interested in eliciting stories of counselling in order to analyse what stories were told, as well as how they were told. Langridge's model incorporates 6 stages. There's an important focus on reflexivity. There's a critical moment where the researcher employs what Langridge calls imaginative hermeneutics of suspicion. Hermeneutics needs further explanation and will be in the next slide, or next but one. So in doing it, we're moving beyond a simple focus on the apparent and using critical engagement with a social theory. I'm interrogating my way of viewing the topic as well as the narratives. In this way, I'm constructing a selective and interpretive lens to uncover meaning hidden beneath the surface. Langridge's model can be set out in a circular form. I think we need to understand what subjectivity means. This is not a case of simply looking at stories that may or may not mean something. What I'm trying to understand is what they mean in the context, social context in which the stories are told. So in listening carefully to all the participants, I'm identifying narratives, narrative tone and rhetorical function. In other words, what people are trying to say, and I'm getting a sense of how they see their identity. And also, I will identify different themes that occur and their priorities and the relationships that people have in terms of how they position themselves in society. Destabilizing the narrative is questioning things and actually coming up with my own interpretation and being very open about how I've arrived at that interpretation. So that we're looking at not only that we can listen to stories and understand that they're not simply to be placed in the box of anecdote, but can tell us something about how people experience life in relation to each other. And I can also experience my encounter with those people in terms of how it affects my understanding of what's going on as I get older and I carry on my work as a coach and a counsellor or an existential therapist. So Ricoeur's ideas about hermeneutics, in other words, we need to understand how we look at the text of somebody's narrative and the story they're telling, and we understand the fact that we may learn to become the narrator of our own story, but we don't ever completely become the author of our life, an account of the social context having a powerful effect upon us. I contend that changes and transitions happen throughout our lives, and that the stories we tell about our experiences are socially constructed through interaction in our relationships with each other. Finally, placing this research in the context of the pandemic and the current situation in this country today, I think this has brought into sharp focus what is described by Anna Dixon, who's the chief executive of the Centre for Aging Better. And she wrote a book, which is really, I think, a powerful understanding of the age of positive aging, because aging better is the way they tend to describe the fact that life could be very different for many people in later life. It is already good for many people who have either the economic means or have had previous lifelong learning experiences which facilitate their ability to enjoy the last part of their life. But actually, the effects of ageism are deeply damaging. And as Anna Dixon says, all too often it isn't taken as seriously as other forms of prejudice or discrimination. And therefore, I agree with Anna Dixon that we're long overdue a fundamental culture shift to overturn these attitudes. And the media needs to reflect the diverse experience of people in later life. From a human rights and social justice perspective, my multidisciplinary research contributes to the now urgent fundamental culture shift advocated by the Centre for Aging Better. I am investigating existing unequal power relationships within UK society, exposing potential injustice and human rights abuse, and promoting an anti-oppressive counselling practice, as advocated by Gillian Proctor in her 2017 book about power in counselling relationships. I'm trying to respect individual differences and value diversity amongst older people. There's also a need to fill the knowledge gap in the field of psychotherapy research that investigates recognizing diversity and working with difference, particularly in working with people in later life. I haven't got time to go through an analysis of my transcripts, but obviously it's useful to highlight some degree of understanding of what this process throws up. So sub-themes can be, if I take the transitions theme, which is only one of a number of themes, there may be sub-themes such as retirement, identity, loss and bereavement. Right? So in a description that is obviously just telling a story, which may be a long and often very moving story of the sort of adversity people encounter in later life, I am trying to form an analysis which maybe talks to the conversation that is going on about experiences of later life and understanding how we may perceive this alongside somebody in the counselling relationship. It's a joint project. It's a co-action. It's not something in which we're telling people what's going on. We are talking to them and they are telling their story and trying to reach their own understanding. So here's one example of me trying to summarize that in this particular case. Only one section of the interaction between myself and the participant and their description of what they hoped counselling or talking therapy would be able to help them or would facilitate for them in terms of moving forward. Adjusting to distressing change and transition in both retirement and loss had led to complex and conflicting thoughts and feelings for Jane at the time of requesting counselling. Her internal dialogue, and we all have these, was around both her bereavement and the personal transformation in her sense of identity, which was experienced during the retirement process. A different story and a different person and a different context. Gloria had requested counselling at a time of experiencing both a life course transition, which she identified as very significant, and also complex grief. She also recalled her hopes and expectations that a therapeutic counselling relationship might facilitate the process of working through her own distressing internal conflicts and powerfully troubled feelings, such as her overwhelming anger towards the healthcare services because of the circumstances of her mother's death, as well as finally being able to grieve for her losses and move on with her transformed life. For many people, their own grieving is interrupted by their efforts to help the person who, for example, one parent grieving for another, to go through that process. You're in a supportive and a caring role, and maybe your own grief is put on hold. I think that identity and self-expression are very important in the modern world. I think that we do have a sense of agency, and we need to continue into later life our identity, which may be around identities of disability, gender, race, and sexuality. As we're seen in later life, just as old people, that incorporates such a wide range, such a diverse range of people. We need to respect the fact that people are not necessarily resisting old age, but they're resisting the social image of old age, which tends to be somewhat negative at the very least. And it sort of neuters the identity by preventing them from expressing the individuality they have. So, according to the research, staying black, staying gay, staying gendered, and staying disabled, it's not about clinging on to youth. It's about retaining the virtues of these particular identities and their embodiment, feeling that sense of individuality and that sense of who we are. And the same can be said of the wider narratives and practices of a generation, and this is part of my generation in terms of the baby boomers born after the Second World War. We have learned to privilege choice and autonomy and self-expression and pleasure. Many people are denied those things, or at least some of them. And the idea in the past of experiencing pleasure would be quite a novelty or completely unheard of, especially in much later life. Meaning and purpose is important, and Viktor Frankl's writing and work has helped me considerably. And it's vital for our well-being. This is my approach to therapy. I realize it's a particular approach that I bring to the task, but I contend that meaning flows from our connectivity with others. It stems from the way in which we're connected and engaged with the fundamental aspects of who we are. It brings our values and beliefs together with our emotional response to the world. And all these elements are needed to make sense of our present experiences, as well as giving us a sense of direction in life. Frankl believed that this meaning sets the pace for being. We need to know to take ourselves forward, we need to know who we are and where we're going. Continued social engagement, meaning and purpose in later life remain the key themes in my ongoing research. Pierre Bourdieu was very concerned with self-determination, autonomy, and choice, particularly for the most disadvantaged in society. My research argues that Bourdieu's concepts are particularly relevant to the day-to-day experiences of ageist discrimination, marginalisation, and social exclusion of many older people in the UK today. According to Foucault, discourses such as psychotherapy also tell those under its influence what sort of person they are, why this category of person is experiencing certain problems, and by contrast, what a normal person is. In ways that are often implicit, discourses such as psychotherapy make normalizing judgments. And this knowledge is then used sometimes to try to turn the individual into the normal person depicted by the discourse. Gillian Proctor proposes that medicalisation terms tend to divert attention from the socio-political and environmental causes of distress. In her words, namely the experience of abuse, deprivation, and powerlessness. My research argues that this perspective is particularly relevant to counselling practice with older people when taking into account the broader social context. Vanessa Berholt looks at ageism in terms of how it brings about social exclusion for many people. She coins the term intersectionality to bring about a holistic understanding of the very diverse experiences of disadvantage and discrimination experienced in later life. The Centre for Aging Better is also researching ageism and has previously used the term double jeopardy in their reports to identify that older people may be experiencing a whole range of different kinds of discrimination. I'm saying that in the experience of many people in later life, social exclusion is real and is a complex and dynamic experience that leads also to the non-realization of social, economic, political, and cultural rights of participation within society. Social relations may be defined as comprising social resources, social connections, and social networks. Westwood describes this from a social justice perspective. She says in her book and after her research that older people not only need to access a wide range of resources in later life and to be recognized and valued as equal members of society, but they also need parity of participation, i.e., they need social connectedness, social engagement, community involvement, political voice, advocacy when necessary, and inclusion in research. That is one of the reasons why I am trying to do this research by listening to the voices of people over 65. Only when all three dimensions of equality are attained for older people across the diversity spectrum will social justice in later life have been achieved. I tend to agree with Westwood in that respect. When I'm looking at transition across the lifespan, I think it's useful to understand it from Anthony Giddens' perspective of fateful moments. Giddens says, sometimes when events come together in such a way that an individual stands, as it were, at the crossroads in their existence, and that such events can have serious consequences for their future life trajectory. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. If this was a live presentation and not a recording, I would obviously now be opening up this to questions. But I'd be delighted if people wanted to get in touch with me to discuss these issues further, which obviously, because of my research and my continuing practice, which I hope is just developing, and it would actually be a continuing conversation amongst both therapists and the service users of health services who are concerned about how we can look after mental health in the future, and how we can actually experience later life in a more positive way. Thank you very much.